Right, welcome to this second lesson on how to analyse spoken mode texts for AQA language and literature. We are focused on remembered places, the Paris anthology, and this lesson will look particularly at pragmatics of spoken discourse. If you missed the first lesson on mode, you might find it's useful to go back and watch that one first. But if you're just interested for whichever course you're studying in the pragmatics of spoken discourse, then this lesson is going to cover quite a lot of ground fairly quickly. Before we start, it's always worth pausing the video at key points when there are exercises or where there's a lot of information, and making sure that you keep effective notes. So you'll know that in your AQA glossary, pragmatics is a distinct language level and one that is somewhat awkward to apply in a Lang Lit course. Because it doesn't feel like a natural thing to be applying to literature, but we'll look into ways in which we can apply it to literature and not just spoken language texts at the end of this lesson. Your AQA glossary, hopefully in the course of this lesson, we can cover the theory behind just about every aspect of that glossary. Just to be sure why we're doing this, there is I believe 15 marks available in the AQA Remembered Places question for context, and we are trying to get away from thinking of context in terms of social political facts and move towards thinking of linguistic contexts. Or literary contexts in the case of the literature that you study. And pragmatics is the study of interactional contexts. So this is really fundamental to being able to secure a good mark for AO3 in the Remembered Places question. It's really important to have that understanding of pragmatics of texts. Okay, have a look at this wonderful joke. Get around in English. Lesson 25, how to be polite. You can see here the language that gets the desired effect for the drowning man is perhaps not the language that we'd expect. And I'm going to explain this hilarious joke later as an example of how pragmatics helps us to understand whether language works or not in a given context. Pragmatics is the study of language in context, and Wikipedia defines it. I like the fact that the Wikipedia definition gives you a difference between what semantics is and what pragmatics is. Semantics may look at you'll know in semantics you study the connotations of language. Well, connotations are somewhat predictable within the language itself. However, there's nothing predictable about the context of pragmatics. So in pragmatics, we're not looking perhaps at the connotations of the language, but the way that that language has to be interpreted in a particular interactional context, in a particular context of utterance. So we need to know about the purpose, the function, the status, the location of speakers in order to interpret meaningfully how language is communicating. So there's a lot of ambiguity in spoken texts. Any kind of spoken utterance taken out of context can often lose almost all of its meaning. So we need to understand the manner of speech, the place of speech, the time of speech, for example. And that's explained in this paragraph, in this slide here, on the importance of pragmatics. Written modes usually give us their context. Literary texts give us their contexts because they don't want to mislead readers. And so for example, in a literary text, a setting will be clearly established by an author, but in a spoken discourse, in spoken contexts, speakers assume a lot of this. So the context is often not represented linguistically. It has to be interpreted or understood by all the speakers, and it's done implicitly rather than explicitly. And that can make spoken discourse very difficult to actually interpret from the outside. You need that understanding of context. And that's what pragmatics is. It's discussing or examining ways in which the context of a particular utterance changes the meaning or affects the meaning. So let's have a look at this cartoon and let's examine exactly why this joke was so hilariously funny. There were two contexts influencing the joke in this section. The title will have established that this was something about how to get around in English, and the Englishman there, you can see, is presented as kind of a stereotypical Englishman. He has a bowler hat and a bulldog, and there's a bus full of tea, or a lorry load full of tea going over the bridge. So there's two contexts. One is the urgency of the drowning man's situation, and the second is the Englishness of the person who potentially could save him. And the two utterances that the man gives would be appropriate for those two different contexts. So that imperative help would obviously be appropriate in that context A, which is I'm drowning, I need help. And the address used in context B, the overly polite one, is perhaps referring to the context of the Englishness and the politeness of the person being spoken to. Now, the joke is, of course, that in a life or death situation, we'd expect that context, the fact that I'm about to die, to be the one that determines what language we use. I guess the joke is showing that, the English value politeness so much, it's more important than life or death. But we needed to understand those two contexts in order to interpret the way that language was being used in that joke. So that gives you a little idea of what pragmatics is. It's looking at the way that context influences the way that we understand speech. We're going to cover in this lesson roughly these 5 points. I say this lesson, this could easily be 5 different lessons. This will give only a theoretical or a clear, I hope, clear overview of the theory of these different things. You will obviously be applying them later in your own work. It could easily be more than one lesson, this. So this is very much a kind of condensed view, but I'm hoping that it's clear enough and that the activities enable you to understand these things before we move on. So let's have a look at speech acts and have a little look at this classic Mr. Logic cartoon from Viz magazine. Another classic contextual misunderstanding. Mr. Logic, the joke with Mr. Logic is that he takes all utterances, he takes all speech and language at surface value, at its face value, and he doesn't read contexts. But that's not how normal speakers interact. We do read contexts, and actually we could interpret the lady stopping Mr. Logic in the street. We could interpret what she meant by saying, "Excuse me, sir, do you mind if I stop you for a second?" We could interpret that accurately using the context of things such as at the precinct, the fact that he's in a shopping centre where, we know we're commonly stopped by people asking us for things, the clipboard, the general typical nature of this kind of interaction would enable us to interpret that when she says, "Excuse me, sir, do you mind if I stop you for a second?" she is actually doing more than just asking us a question. She's requesting for us to stop and spend time with her, and we can also interpret that the second is not going to literally be a second, but rather is going to mean a short space of time, and she's referring to the fact that she doesn't intend to keep us for very long. Mr. Logic, of course, doesn't see these things. So this is an example of the context dependence of speech. In order to interpret that utterance, we needed to read all of those contextual clues. Here's an example of a text that maybe Mr. Logic would understand. And this is legal texts. Legal texts densely provide all of their context to prevent any kind of misunderstanding. And this is the kind of language that results when you attempt to provide every contextual variable. Have a little look at the typical paragraph below. Now you can probably see how dense, how formal, how precise that language is. It just can't be misinterpreted. And I guess, it's a form of language, legal language, that, requires years of practice and expertise to interpret accurately. But it leaves nothing ambiguous, nothing to be interpreted. So, in a sense, if you remember from the last lesson, Hudson's Dimensions of Mode, we talked about the context dependence of different texts. We know that spoken language is highly context dependent, whereas perhaps legal language and to a certain extent literature provides its own context and so can be kind of independent of context. Here's an example of what we call a speech act from the classic piece of literature Eat Your Peas by Kes Gray and Nick Sharratt. It's a bedtime classic, and it gives you an example of how a speech act conveys more than is directly said. In this classic piece of literature, Daisy will not eat her peas. And so as you can see from the page that's been pasted in the picture there, Mum says, if you eat your peas, you can have 48 desserts, stay up past midnight, you never have to take a bath again, and I'll buy you 2 new bikes and a baby elephant. I'm interested particularly in the sentence, or the part of the sentence that says, if you eat your peas, you can have 48 desserts. I think I know what Mum is saying to Daisy, and I think Daisy would know what Mum is saying. But if you look at what Mum actually says, it could be that Mum is just simply stating a fact. If you eat your peas, you can have 48 desserts. Is Mum just saying that this is possible, or is Mum doing something more than that? Well, we know, obviously, in the context of Mum talking to Daisy and trying to get her to eat her peas, that Mum is offering her a promise. Mr. Logic might have a little bit of difficulty with this statement, but here's a comparative, almost grammatically identical statement that we would interpret very differently. The estate agent showing me around a house I'm interested in buying says, if you buy this house, you can extend the kitchen in the garden. Is the estate agent promising to build me an extension? No, I don't think he is. So you can see how identical grammatical statements can be interpreted in wildly different contexts, so that what is conveyed is much more than what is actually said. And this is the essence of a speech act. So here's an example of some kinds of speech acts, and these are, if you like, actions performed in speech that are often above and beyond the literal and direct meaning of what's actually said. So representatives, which I guess are statements. You might say something like, the beauty of me is that I'm very rich. Commissives are forms of, I guess, promises or vows. I am going to build a wall. So I think that Mum was obviously offering Daisy a commissive in order to encourage her to eat her peas. Directives are used by a speaker who is trying to get some kind of response or action from the person they're talking to. So requests, challenges, dares. I would like you to do us a favour, though, would be an example of a request. Declarations, they are statements which represent an immediate change of affairs or a change of status. For example, you're fired. And expressives, they can greet, thank, complain, congratulate, and they express some kind of psychological state, such as fake news, a total political witch hunt. So all of our day-to-day speech is full of speech acts that perhaps go above and beyond what may be literally said to create some kind of concrete meaning, an action of speech, which we can later be held to account for. So linguists describe these speech acts using the following terms, and I think this is from a guy called Searle, who's a philosopher of language. There are 3 parts to any given speech act, according to linguists. The locutionary act, which is the literal meaning given. The illocutionary act, which is the meaning intended or the function of speech, so what is actually communicated. And the perlocutionary act, which is the resulting effect or consequence, particularly the response that a given piece of speech gets. So this could be Paris. It looks a little bit like Paris, a tree-lined boulevards. Well-groomed man drops to his knee, out comes the jeweler's box. He opens it, he presents a ring, and he says, "I would like you to be my wife." I think I know what's going on there, but can you describe how this act might be interpreted using those three terms, the locutionary act, illocutionary act, and the perlocutionary act? Pause now, sketch in your notes, and we'll discuss as we restart. So the locutionary act is actually only a statement. It's not a request. You could just imagine if this guy had been proposing to Mr. Logic, there might have been some kind of comic misunderstanding here. But I think that any speaker or any receiver would know that in this context, that this is actually a request, a marriage proposal. Note that it isn't formed as a question, so we're going beyond, I guess, identifying. We might be able to identify sentence forms when we describe locutionary acts, but the actual intended meaning or function of speech, this is, I guess, a question. He is asking the question, what is often referred to as the pop the question. And so it is, in that sense, it is, I guess, a question. It is a request, but it isn't framed in language as a request. So we get the difference there, the classic speech act difference, in that what is meant, what is conveyed, is much more than what is actually said. The perlocutionary act, the resulting effect or consequence, well, we don't know because we don't have the full transcript of this interaction, and to be honest, it looks a bit posed anyway. But we can imagine that she would either give a breathless acceptance, or perhaps she might, I don't know, hedge her response and show some kind of awkwardness, and we could obviously interpret the way that she responds to his illocutionary act. Okay, we move on now to Deixis, which is accompanied by this really, really useful diagram. Deixis is the way that we describe language that uses the position of the producer to be interpreted. And I am here now telling you about Lexis, where you are telling you about Deixis, where you are over there, wherever you are in time. Perhaps you're listening to this later tomorrow, and you understand that it's earlier when I'm doing this. Well, everything that I say is centered around my current position in time, and you know that when I say I mean me, because I'm speaking. You know that when I say here, I mean the location which I stand, and when I say now, you know that I mean the time at which I'm speaking. So that creates a kind of deictic center. The center of an utterance means that we know the words I, here, and now refer to the identity, the place, and the time of a particular kind of speech. But of course, we can also use language to look forward and backwards in time, to look away from us in spatial dimensions, and also to look at different people. So these are different kinds of deictic reference, and these deixis include spatial deixis, for example, here and there, temporal deixis, now, later, earlier, a personal deixis, I, you, they, the first, the third, the second person, and also we have discourse deixis, which can refer to things being discussed. This idea is better than that idea because. There's a link there for you to follow if you think you need a little bit more help on Deixis, but the image there is really the most useful for helping to understand, and if you could either print out a copy of that image or perhaps sketch it and label it, it is very, very useful visual representation of the way Deixis works in language. How might we interpret Deixis in texts? Well, you're going to need to pause the video at this point and answer these two quick little questions based on snippets from the AQA anthology. These are examples of use of spatial Deixis and personal Deixis in two spoken transcripts from AQA Paris anthology. Pause your video now and have a go, see if you can interpret the way Deixis is used in these interactions. Right, welcome back. You'll have noticed that Anna used two spatial Deixis terms. She used there to convey, I guess, a distance between her location and her subject, Paris. If she'd been speaking in Paris, she would have said here. So we can interpret her use of Deixis to suggest where she's speaking from. She also has this curious introductory sentence. I feel like I should say hi, so hi, this is Anna here, and I'm going to talk about Paris. Seems odd for her to use here to refer to her own deictic centre in conversation. I think perhaps that suggests that she knew she was being recorded and that perhaps she knew she was addressing receivers who weren't in the same location. We often describe ourselves as being here when we talk on the phone to people, and I suppose that might be an acknowledgement of the distance between, the spatial distance between where we're speaking from and where our receiver is. For example, it would seem quite strange for you to say, hi, this is Anna here, in interpersonal conversation where you were standing in the same location, because, well, I think they kind of know where you are, they can see you. So I think that here, personal, the spatial Deixis there that relates to her deictic centre is perhaps acknowledging her position relative to those listening to her. In the second extract, the third person, them and they, creates a kind of a distance between the subject, which is waiters, and the speakers. The second person, you, is also an example of personal Deixis, but I think it's used a little bit differently. If you looked at the difference between the way that Sophia and the way that Mike are using this personal Deixis, you'll notice that Sophia uses the second person to address Mike. What was your impression of the waiters, and did you, she asks in an incomplete utterance. Whereas Mike uses the second person a little bit more generally, saying such things as when they realise that you're English, or they aren't really speaking English when you're there. He's using you, the second person, as a kind of personal Deixis to create an idea of a shared experience of Paris. So he's actually using that, I think, to create a sense of building relationships with his speaker. In both cases, we can interpret Deixis to explain how the speaker's position is established relative to their subject, relative to their receiver. And this is valuable not only in interpreting spoken text, but this is also a really important part of the way that authors in literature build an imaginative or an imagined reality around the centre of particular characters. We'll think perhaps later on how a writer like Margaret Atwood uses Deixis to create a world around her narrator Offred. Okay, moving on, we have accommodation theory. When I was young, I went on holiday to Canada and I stayed with relatives over in Canada, and when I came back, lo and behold, I had a Canadian accent. Kids do that all the time. If they spend time with people who speak in a different way to the way that they're used to speaking, they assimilate their accents. And the reason is because instinctively we converge our style of speech with people we're speaking to. So in conversation, we're always adapting depending on who we're speaking to, and that adaptation can be defined in terms of increasing or decreasing social distance. Mostly, we seek to decrease social distance. We seek to build relationships through conversation and speech, and so we converge. We match the way that we speak to the way that the person we're speaking to uses language. There are occasions, however, where we choose to perhaps assert our individuality or our own identity as a means of perhaps increasing social distance. In these cases, we diverge. We perhaps deliberately use language in a different way from the person we're speaking to. Needn't necessarily be unfriendly, but it's certainly a way of increasing social distance because you're heightening the contrast between your identity and the identity of the person you're speaking to. So there's a couple of questions, or a few questions here, that are relevant to ask about this theory, the accommodation theory of accommodating other speakers. We might ask, well, how does this work with status? Is it the case that we converge upwards with people, in that we, I guess, want to show respect through converging with people who are viewed as our social superiors. An interesting question, perhaps one that you can investigate in an NEA, in a coursework. What other contextual factors could determine convergence and divergence? Other factors affecting identity. For example, if you had, in the example that I gave, if you'd moved from one country to another, to what extent would you preserve your own identity, and to what extent would you converge with speakers in the country that you came to? Is convergence the norm, and do we have an instinct towards convergence? If you look, groups of people with shared identities everywhere form similar speech patterns. So it seems that we have an instinct to converge, but we are also all individual we all have our own idiolect, our own unique, different ways of speaking. And so we don't fully converge with speakers. We aren't robotic copiers of other people's speech patterns, and we like to have our own speech quirks. So there's an extent to which we think, or it might be thought that, we always try and preserve our own identity by diverging to an extent. And also, finally, of course, that question we can ask, how would accommodation come into play when visiting Paris? If you were a tourist in Paris, how would you perhaps change the language that you used to communicate with Parisians or with people around you? Do you use language differently when you're a foreigner in a strange land? An interesting question, and if you do get the chance to go abroad, in the current circumstances it seems unlikely, but if you do get that chance, then it's always worth actually reflecting on the way that changing your location changes your own language. Okay. Based on similar ideas to the accommodation theory are Grice's ideas about cooperation, and for some reason I chose to frame this rather jauntily in terms of an imagined play script. So something that Grice might have said, or at least something that provides a very good summary of his ideas about cooperation. Grice says that speech is cooperative, and speakers have shared goals and conventions, i.e. rules, for achieving these goals. And you as a student might say, do go on, Mr. Grice, tell us more, such as Grice devises 4 maxims, 4 rules, which describe our expectations of conversation. So these are the conversational rules of the game, and this is a significant contribution that Grice made to linguistic theory, because it seems to accurately capture the way that speakers cooperate in conversation. And these are 4 maxims. The maxim of quantity says that you say the right amount, not too much or not too little. The maxim of relevance, as a rule, says that what you say is relevant to the topic of conversation. We follow topics and we keep our speech relevant, applied relevantly. The third maxim is the maxim of manner, which means that we offer our contribution to conversation in a way that can be understood by others. And finally, the maxim of quality, we don't mislead people. We say what we think is true. So, if I was to ask you this question, could you tell me how to find the toilet? How would these 5 possible responses break different maxims of different rules of conversation as described by Grice's maxims? Have a pause, have a look at those 5 possible responses, and see if you can identify which of the maxims are being broken or flouted in this example. Okay, the first one, fairly obviously, is breaking the rule of quality, because if, I guess, the contextual information in there says that they do have a toilet and someone says we don't have one, well, that's just a straightforward lie. It breaks the maxim of quality, it misleads. I guess in other ways it communicates in an effective manner and it communicates the right quantity. but it certainly breaks the maxim of quality or truth. The second answer, travel 4 furlongs south by southeast. Well, there are actually I guess, points in time where distance would be meaningfully expressed using furlongs. That's a measurement of distance. I guess it's usually used to measure fields or something. It's quite an agricultural term. South by southeast, there is at least one Aboriginal language in which there is no left and right, but directions can only be expressed based on compass points. However, our language is not one of those. This might be a truthful answer. The toilet might actually be 4 furlongs away in a south by southeasterly direction. It's not, however, contributed in a way that can be understood by most speakers, so it violates the maxim of manner, which is the third one on the list above. A3, sure, downstairs on your right. Well, to me, that doesn't seem to violate any of the maxims. This is a good example of all of the maxims being met. It's not too much, not too little. It's direct, it's relevant, it's clear, and we can assume, because we're not told otherwise, that it's truthful. A4, the fourth answer, seems to be an irrelevant contribution where the speaker is going off topic by offering their own speech. It also looks like it might violate the maxim of quantity in that this speaker, implied by the ellipsis, is going on and on and on, and is therefore violating the maxim of saying the right amount. And I think that's also the maxim violated by A5, because I guess that violates, well, it seems like a bit of a Mr. Logic type response. The speaker in that context has failed to interpret the request. They've interpreted the question more as a statement about, or as a question about whether they could or couldn't tell them how to find the toilet, and therefore they haven't given the right quantity, and they haven't communicated in the expected way. So these are where communication breaks down. Communication breaks down when we break one of the 4 maxims, one of the 4 rules of speech. But we often do that. We often break these rules in significant or meaningful ways. Sometimes rules are broken because of misunderstandings, and broken conversational maxims result in a breakdown of communication. But sometimes breaking these maxims is its own form of communication. They are intentionally flouted. And this is a really crucial concept in pragmatics. This is the concept of implicature. This is where conversational maxims are intentionally flouted. And here, implicatures are deeply meaningful. So we have an example here of 4 implicatures, i.e. broken maxims, which actually convey meaning in meaningful ways. So, pause the video, ask yourself which maxims are being violated, and in the context of these 4, and ask yourself what might be meaningfully conveyed by the broken rule in each case.